I was standing in my kitchen at 6 a.m., holding a coffee mug that wasn't mine, in a house I'd lived in for 12 years, wondering why none of it felt familiar anymore. That's not a metaphor. I mean it literally. I looked at the mug, chipped on the handle, a faded logo from a conference I barely remembered attending, and for a second I genuinely didn't know why I owned it. It wasn't a big moment. Nobody would have noticed if they'd walked in. But something about standing there, 40 years old, staring at a coffee mug like it belonged to a stranger, made me feel like I'd been sleepwalking through my own life. I want to tell you how that morning started, because it matters. 2 weeks earlier, my father had passed away. Not suddenly, he'd been sick for a while, but the kind of passing that still manages to surprise you when it actually happens. I flew back for the funeral, said the right things to the right people, hugged my mother, nodded at old family friends whose names I'd forgotten. Then I flew home and went back to work 3 days later, because that's what responsible people do. That's what I'd always believed, anyway. I worked in project management for a mid-sized logistics company. 15 years there. I was good at my job, organized, dependable, the guy who always had a plan B. My colleagues used to joke that I ran my personal life like a spreadsheet. I used to laugh at that. I don't think I found it funny anymore, but I still laughed, because that's what you do when a joke has been repeated enough times that people expect the same reaction from you every time. I had a wife, Sarah, and a 14-year-old son, Ethan. On paper, everything was fine. We had dinner together most nights. We took a trip to the coast every summer. I coached Ethan's baseball team for 2 seasons before work got too demanding. From the outside, it looked like a life that worked. But here's the thing I hadn't let myself think about until that morning with the mug: I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything. Not sadness, not joy, not even boredom. Just a kind of low static that hummed underneath everything I did. The strange part started a few days after the funeral. My mother called and asked if I wanted my father's watch. He'd worn it every day for 30 years, an old steel Seiko with a cracked crystal he never bothered fixing. I said yes, mostly out of obligation, and she mailed it to me. When it arrived, I set it on my dresser and didn't touch it for 4 days. I told myself I was busy. But every time I walked past it, something in me tightened, like my body was avoiding a conversation my mind wasn't ready to have. On the 5th day, I finally picked it up. And that's when I noticed something odd. Scratched into the underside of the metal band, so small you'd need to really look for it, were 3 letters and a number, JT 1987. Not my father's initials. Not my mother's. I sat there turning it over in my hands, feeling a strange, quiet unease, the kind that isn't scary, just unsettling, like a word you can't quite remember even though it's right at the edge of your mind. I called my mother and asked if she knew anything about it. There was a pause on the line, longer than it should have been for a simple question. "That was your father's friend," she said finally. "From before we met. He passed away a long time ago. Your dad kept a few of his things after. That was it." No elaboration. And something about how quickly she moved the conversation forward, asking about Ethan's school, the weather, anything else, told me there was more to it than she was saying. I didn't push. But it stayed with me. I remember thinking, my father wore a dead friend's watch for 30 years and never once mentioned it to me. What else did I not know about him? That question sat in the back of my mind for weeks. I went back to my routine, meetings, deadlines, dinners with Sarah where we talked about Ethan's grades and whether we needed a new water heater. But underneath it, something had shifted. I started noticing how much of my life ran on autopilot. How I answered questions before I'd actually thought about them. How I'd stopped asking Sarah how she was doing in any way that expected a real answer. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was clearing out some boxes in the garage, my father's things that my mother had shipped after the funeral, and I found a small notebook. Not a journal exactly. More like a collection of scattered notes, dates, a few names. On one page, dated a few months before he died, my father had written a single line, "Told no one what mattered. Regret that more than anything." I sat on the garage floor for a long time after reading that. Not crying, not really. Just still. I thought about the watch. About JT, whoever he was, and whatever my father had never said about him. I thought about how careful my father had always been, kind, but guarded. A man who loved deeply but rarely said so out loud. I used to think that was just his generation. Now I wondered if it was something he passed down to me without either of us noticing. Because I realized, sitting there, that I did the exact same thing. I told Ethan I was proud of him maybe twice a year, and only when there was a good reason, a grade, a win, an achievement. I never told him I was proud of him for just being who he was on an ordinary Tuesday. I told Sarah I loved her the way you'd say, "See you later," automatic, unconsidered, true but empty of weight. I'd spent 40 years assuming there'd be time later to say the things that mattered. My father had assumed the same thing about JT, about whatever regret he carried, and he ran out of time before he said it. That night, I didn't say anything dramatic to my family. I didn't sit them down for a big speech. That's not who I am, and honestly, I think big speeches make people suspicious more than they make people feel loved. Instead, I did something smaller. I sat with Ethan while he did his homework, not checking my phone, not half listening. Just there. And at one point I told him, unprompted, that I liked the way he thought about things, how he asked questions instead of just accepting answers. He looked up, a little surprised, like he wasn't used to getting that kind of comment without an achievement attached to it. He just said, "Thanks, Dad," and went back to his homework. It wasn't a big moment on the surface. But something in me settled. Over the following weeks, I started paying attention differently. I noticed when Sarah seemed tired before she said anything about it. I asked her real questions and actually waited for real answers. I started keeping my father's watch on my dresser where I could see it every morning, not to wear it, but as a kind of quiet reminder. Not of him exactly. Of the notebook. Of that one line he wrote. I never did find out the full story of JT. My mother eventually told me a little more, an old friend from before she and my father met, someone he'd lost touch with before he passed, something he never fully resolved. She didn't know the details either. And I've made peace with that. I think some things are meant to stay unfinished. What mattered wasn't solving the mystery. What mattered was what the mystery revealed about the man who kept it. Here's what I came to understand, slowly, over those weeks. We spend so much of our lives assuming the people around us know how we feel. We think love is obvious, that gratitude is implied, that presence speaks for itself. But most of us are quietly walking around with our own version of that notebook, things we meant to say, feelings we assumed were understood, moments we thought we'd have more time for. My father wasn't a cold man. He loved fiercely, in his own way. But he carried a silence that, without meaning to, he handed down to me. And I probably would have handed it to Ethan too, without ever noticing, if a chipped coffee mug and a cracked old watch hadn't stopped me in my tracks long enough to actually look at my own life. I'm not saying I've fixed everything. I still catch myself running on autopilot some days. Old patterns don't disappear just because you notice them once. But I pay attention now in a way I didn't before. I say the small things out loud. I ask the real questions and wait for the real answers. I sometimes think about that notebook, about that one line my father wrote near the end. And I wonder how many of us are walking around right now, assuming we'll get to say the important things later, to the people sitting right next to us. What would you want someone to know, if you assumed you had less time than you think you do?